Saint Francis was not really, about the scholarly life, right? He was not about owning a lot of books or, really he was marked by simplicity. So I'm wondering about how the development of intellectual life within the Franciscan order took place early on, not just with regard to Scotus, but even more generally.
Yeah, those are nice observations. You're exactly right. This was a big tension within the Franciscan order. What's interesting is that it, it was the tension was almost bound to be there, because on the one hand you had the Saint Francis's own emphasis on poverty. The Franciscans are a mendicant order; they can't own anything officially, or at least from the original inspiration, and yet theological education and formation as priests, as missionaries, etc., was also from a very early period a big part of what the Franciscans had to do to replicate themselves and to carry out their mission. So as the Franciscan movement spread, they would set up houses where it would be a sort of local home base for their ministry. But then as they attracted vocations, they had to form these people somehow, and that involved some amount of study. So what you find is wrestling early on with, like, well, we can't just camp outside of Assisi and live in huts the way that Saint Francis did at certain points of his early adventures with his order of little brothers. We have to have some kind of stability, and yet we can't own anything. So they were reliant on, often when we think of begging, we think of, asking for a loaf of bread or something after giving a sermon. But of course, the Franciscans could get gifts of, say, timbers, trees from a local baron's forest to provide the frame of a house. And if the land that they were building on was donated by a local bishop, then they didn't own the real estate either. And so they found ways around these restrictions on ownership. So that by the time the Franciscans arrived in Francis's own lifetime, by the way, in England, in the early 1220s, by I think 1230, there was a Franciscan house, at least the rudiments of one, in Oxford, which was the preeminent university in England at the time. Now, it's one thing to recognize the importance of some sort of theological learning, like, let's make sure our little brothers know the Bible. It's another thing to think that there's a vocational value to studying the philosophy of Aristotle, or studying great church fathers, or learning a lot about Saint Augustine. And that was the tension that the Oxford Franciscans faced, as well as other places too. But the Oxford Franciscans were blessed with Robert Grosseteste, a wonderful Oxford scholar, himself not a Franciscan, but as he witnessed the Franciscan movement taking shape in Oxford, he became very attracted to their apostolate, and so got closely involved and was personally involved in teaching them, and became a good role model for going really deep into learning the liberal arts and church fathers and this new stuff of Aristotle that was all the rage in those days, while also holding fast to learning the Bible, being saturated in scripture and all of that. So from the 1230s, when Robert Grosseteste takes hold of the Franciscan house and sort of makes his mark on it, until the 1270s, late 1270s, 80s, when Scotus gets there, roughly a 50-year period, there was a really rich intellectual culture that Scotus was able to enter into.
Maybe we can talk a little bit about the dispute between the Franciscans and the Dominicans, and the sort of how that began. This sort of this thing that people sort of joke about now, but it's still there on an intellectual level, of course, if not so heated as it once was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I think if you if you say you've gone to a Catholic college and maybe you've taken a few theology, philosophy classes, and if you have anything in your mind about the differences between Franciscans and Dominicans, maybe the issue of univocity versus analogy would come to mind, or something like that. But that's not that wasn't part of the original tension between these two orders, and the tension wasn't universal, but there were some issues. One kind of one pretty distinctive thing is that Franciscans in general, not universally, but in general, tended to be more suspicious of Aristotelianism than the Dominicans were. So the early source of the conflict was that Aquinas and other Dominicans, but again, not all Dominicans, seemed to have agreed with certain propositions of Aristotle that were deemed incompatible with the Christian faith. And it was Franciscans who, sort of, so to speak, had their, I told you so moment, like this Aristotle stuff, it's going to get you into trouble, it's going to lead you astray. And for a while, at least, they had some ecclesial heft to their assertion. And so you had this issue of just how much Aristotle should be taken seriously by these orders. That seems to have been the kind of wellspring of the intellectual conflict between the orders. There were also issues about, what we might think of as administrative turf wars, in the university cities anyway, which is where the Dominicans and Franciscans would often be literally in close quarters. The place of these religious orders within the university was a little bit awkward. It had to be kind of sorted out over time. The orders would lobby for extra places for their students at the university. They'd lobby for extra faculty positions for their own members. And so they were in a sense competing. They were competing for student places. They were competing for faculty positions. And then you might think of it as that kind of tension erupting into these more serious intellectual disputes. But the issues that divide people of a roughly Thomistic outlook nowadays from people of a roughly Franciscan outlook nowadays, they're quite a bit removed from those early concerns about Aristotelianism, because there's a consensus now about what aspects of Aristotle's philosophy are and are not compatible with the Christian faith. The Aristotle's hylomorphism, the idea that material objects are composites of matter and form, and in particular that the human substantial form is the soul of the body, is the rational soul. That view is official Catholic teaching. So there's a Aristotelian theme that we all agree on now, at least officially in paper. And then some of the things like that the universe is eternally old. Aquinas himself never taught that, but thought that it was philosophically defensible. We just know differently from revelation that that's not in fact the case. Whereas Franciscans tended to reject the eternity of the world, both on the grounds of revelation and on the grounds of philosophy. So these things now, these Aristotelian doctrines are no longer really a source of conflict for any Catholics. And so the issues have moved on. I think if we look to today, the main things would have to do with, broadly speaking, ethics and cognitive psychology, the exactly how the will and the intellect are related in human action, and exactly what our final end is as human beings. And we all parties agree that it's God, of course, but exactly what is beatific vision, and what are the broader philosophical ramifications of the answer we give to whether beatific vision is primarily an act of the will or an act of the intellect. That issue, which was a debate in the Middle Ages, that still animates a lot of discussion, friendly discussion, sometimes not so friendly discussion, amongst Thomists and Franciscans. And then I also mentioned this issue about religious language, whether our words, when we talk about God, mean the same thing as they do when we talk about ordinary creatures. The Thomists famously hold that our words are at best analogical, whereas Scotus, at least, not all Franciscans, but Scotus at least, thought that at least some of our words have exactly the same meaning when we talk about God as we do when we talk about creatures. And that has become quite a controversial issue in contemporary, not merely contemporary, but in the last century or so. That's become quite a hot button issue in the rarefied air of academic theology.